Yes.
Okay, well, welcome from the other side of the world where it's not quite sunrise in Omaha, Nebraska. I am just back from the Association for Education and Journalism and Mass Communication annual meeting up in Toronto, where I'm happy to tell you that social media has become really one of the primary teaching and research topics in my field of journalism and media communication. It's been, I think, a long and interesting road that began for me in Chicago, which is about the second or third largest city in the United States. At age 4, I got very interested in radio broadcasting, and I did that for a couple of decades until I was in my 20s. Decided to go back and study journalism a bit more at Southern Illinois University, did my doctorate in that area. We were very early into technology in the 1980s. We were trying to do statistical analysis with computers in that first decade. And when I arrived in Omaha, Nebraska, we had no internet connection in January of 1989. We had something called the BitNet, which was an academic network that was connected to other academics. And there was a grand total of 40 people on my campus, mostly scientists, who were connected to it. About a year later, we were connected to the internet. The early app was something out of the University of Minnesota called the Gopher. It was a text-based system, and my journalism students set up, in effect, a newswire. We no sooner did that than graphical user interface hit in 1994-95 and changed everything. At that point, I started learning HTML, built the, at that time, Department of Communication website, and got very, very interested in what became the field of computer-mediated communication, CMC. That led me to create that class at UNO and begin to study the question of information richness. You know, we have some audio and video here, which is a richer form of communication than maybe the text box would be in terms of our understanding of each other, culturally and otherwise. So I did write a book. You mentioned at the start that I've written something like 7 books. The first, I guess, important one in this area was something called Free Expression, Age of the Internet, in 1999. We were pretty deep into the web by 1999, and one of my primary areas of study all along has been law. I've been at this intersection of law and statistics, and essentially the word that emerged in 1999 was that we had a paradox. And the paradox was, this is the greatest thing ever, this thing we call the internet, but at the same time, it's the scariest thing ever because all kinds of new problems, challenges surface. And this is all before social media popped, okay? About 2006, I launched my YouTube channel. I have 2 kids, and my older son was in college by this point. He started talking about his Facebook wall. Remember that early on, Facebook only allowed access primarily to students with an EDU email address. So my computer-mediated communication students started showing me their Facebook walls. That got me interested in what was happening in Omaha. We have a tech startup community here called Silicon Prairie. You know, a lot of the tech entrepreneurship started in California in Silicon Valley. But here out in the Midwestern part of the country, there was an interest in starting digital companies. So we have an event every year called Big Omaha, and that led us to create the class in 2009 called Social Media Metrics. I noticed that your group is interested in marketing. There's a guy I finally met a few years ago in Chicago. His name is Jim Stern. I had talked to them previously only on Skype, and my interviews are on the YouTube channel. But Jim wrote a book called Social Media Metrics. And on the first 5 or 6 pages of that book, he had a list. And it said 100 things you can measure in social media. So, you know, start with likes, shares, comments, replies, go from there across all of these platforms, pins, tweets, right? All of those things are measurable behavior. And so that social media metrics class evolved into work of this UNO Social Media Lab. My first textbook in 2015, Social Media Communication. It's in its 2nd edition right now, and actually working on the 3rd edition for January. In between the 2nd and the 3rd edition, as Deepti mentioned, I wrote the book that just came out July 15, Social Media Measurement and Management. And it basically chronicles the work that my students and I have done in the UNO Social Media Lab with first small business clients and nonprofits, and now rural communities in Nebraska, trying to leverage social media tools so that they can raise awareness about their communities and literally fight to survive in an increasingly urban environment. Not unlike probably what you experience in India. Young people in Nebraska come to the cities for education, stay for jobs, and the small rural communities are struggling to survive. And so that includes the business community, the tourism business, all of those kinds of things. So we've worked with them, and we've had some interesting results. There's a little community in central Nebraska called Ravenna, and it has a population of 1,400, a business district of 1 block, and the economic development director and the Chamber of Commerce director, they share an office, and we came up with the idea that they could start a Facebook Live talk show every week, 10, 15, 20 minutes of what's going on in the community. They've gotten as many as 5,000 views across the entire region. Why is this? Because at the same time social media have taken center stage, traditional radio, newspapers in our communities, and even to some extent local TV are falling behind digital media. And so we really have come full circle back to a friend of mine, David Matheson, who wrote a book called Be the Media in 2008. And David said what became a really rallying cry for me, which was, we are all media now. Every one of us has the power through technology to become our own media entity. And that's why both books, Social Media Communication and Social Media Measurement and Management, and my class start with the idea of personal branding. Personal branding happens by building your LinkedIn network. It happens by blogging. I blogged for about 6 years for Huffington Post. My blogs now appear on LinkedIn as articles. It happens through building followers, my Twitter network, and you can follow me on Twitter at JeremyHL, is something like 6,300. It's taken me all these years, 11 years, to build that network. But there aren't many bots on it. There aren't many spammers. I cleaned that up. So it's roughly a community of 6,000, an online community, as Howard Rheingold would say from the 1990s, virtual communities. It's a network of people who share ideas. And then what we do is share influence through those ideas and content. And as was mentioned at the top, on the research side, we use a tool called NodeXL, which is open source, open data, open science. And it allows us to use social network analysis through algorithms, publicly available algorithms, to basically map, visualize what our network looks like, particularly on Twitter. This works well. So if you go to nodexlgraphgallery.org and you search Jeremy HL, you will find all of the maps that we've been creating for the last 6 years on local and national issues. So maybe the last thing I'll say before we open it up to questions is both of the books that I've written have looked at theory and concepts, which I've already told you I spent a lot of time looking at not only media theory, but computer-mediated communication concepts of identity, interaction, and community, but also looking at the various fields, not only your field of marketing, but the integration of advertising, public relations, radio, television, journalism. There's this great ongoing convergence that's happening. And then we take that knowledge and start to talk about, are there best practices? What are the legal and ethical issues? And then where do we go from here? A lot of that includes not only questions of technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, but also individually media literacy. How do we have the skills to interpret and understand all of this digital media content that we're swimming in? And that's really the challenge I think that we face at this point in development, a decade later. There's so much information out there. There's so much to search through Google and other search engines. There's so much being pushed at us through social media channels. How do we make sense out of it all? Hence, we're in this era where we're talking about things like fake news, media credibility. We've been actually talking about source and message credibility in journalism in the research since the 1960s. So nothing new here, just a whole lot of new technology. And so I think with that, I'll open it up to what questions you have and what you're interested in.
Guys, we are open for Q&A, please.
Hi, Jamie. Yeah, I have a question for you. As you told that across 11 years of your being in this book writing and all your social network building, what sort of difficulties have you faced while coming across different kind of cultures and writing about writing books and developing your social service?
I heard that the question was asking about difficulties, but I didn't get the end of what kind of difficulties you were asking
What
about.
were the
Could you
hindrances?
maybe type that?
Yeah, what were the hindrances when you were going through? I asked what were the hindrances when you were going in your phase and you built up a really good social network and you wrote 2 books. What were the major difficulties that you faced across this period?
Across social networks, I'm not sure in terms of marketing difficulties. The difficulties would be related to identifying influencers that can really carry messages, I would say. That really varies by topic. It varies by context of an individual event. It varies by hashtags. So I don't know if that helps answer the question, but I didn't get all of it. Okay, so now I see your text. What were the hindrances when you were building, your social networks and book writing? Okay, so I think the opportunities were that I was meeting a lot of new people through those social networks. So, and Twitter was the place that I met probably more people than any other place in real time. The challenges, though, were that you didn't always know who you were talking to. Because it was a virtual relationship, there wasn't the level of commitment that you have in face-to-face relationship building. And so I just think we have to be aware that in online relationships, they're not exactly the same, usually until we've actually had that more traditional relationship building. Hope that helps answers that question.
Yes, sir.
Any questions? You can ask the question, we type it out because the audio is not clear. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Just tell I
Pankaj called.
Greeting of the day. My question would be that before that, TV, newspapers, radios were the utmost means of marketing. Now, coming to the point that now social media has taken over. Instagram, Facebook Live, and Twitter has been the platform where people use for marketing. Any insights that you can give us where you thought any technology or some other thing that is up and coming, which can be used for marketing apart from social media? Because you have written a whole book and now in a third edition. Is there anything that you thought that this is the basic trend and something else can come up and take over?
I think the question was related to insights about trends, and I think kind of in the mix between radio, television, and what we now have with all of the social media challenges. And I'm just reading the question now, so I'll read that. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we see in Omaha is that when I first arrived 31 years ago, the newspaper, the Omaha World Herald, had something like a majority, almost 50% of all advertising revenue in the market. They had almost a monopoly on print media. And then there was the rest of media, radio, television, and the like. Now, the downside to media 30 years ago was the gatekeeping and the fact that access was limited. Cable channels were created, access channels were created to try to give regular citizens a voice, but it was really a bad system. You had very few people use it, and the content was pretty poor. You flip to what we have now, and everybody has access. We still have a lot of bad content, but we also get some interesting innovation. So you have things going on Instagram and TikTok and other channels where young people are using these platforms to innovate and create new content that hadn't been seen before. So I think, on balance, we're getting a lot of good out of the technology. Of course, there are problems too. And you no doubt have read in this country that we're struggling because our current president of the United States wants to spend a fair amount of his time attacking traditional media like the New York Times, the television networks, the cable networks. And these folks, are struggling in this digital environment anyway, but we need journalism, the field that I came out of. We need journalists to do investigative reporting, to tell people the truth about our political conditions. And so there is a political struggle, and it in part comes from the fact that when everybody is a media company, their own media brand, they're all challenging for a top spot in that environment. And so it's very competitive. It's very fragmented. And we're very early, keep in mind, early in the second decade of this, the rules are still being written. So, I think from a marketing side, the challenge is every week somebody has a new idea. There are some search engine optimization folks that I follow, including Neil Patel, who talks about the rule of 7, that you have to be in 7 of these channels to have a chance to reach the people you're trying to reach. And of course, just reaching them doesn't mean you're engaging with them. It doesn't mean you're changing behavior. It just means you have the opportunity to raise awareness and possibly to spark engagement. So you have to make a long-term play in marketing, and you have to be in it for the long term. You have to develop, and this is what we do in my class, social media plans, strategies, and tactics, and they have to be driven by the stakeholders. So going back to the example that I mentioned in Ravenna, Nebraska, the Facebook Live talk show that's been successful, we didn't start with, oh, you should do Facebook Live. They came to the decision that their audience was on Facebook, and they wanted to try to experiment with video. Once they had some success with video, we said, well, what about a talk show? And they tried it. So you've got to listen to people, spend a lot of your time, maybe most of your time, listening to find out what people want. I'm seeing a little bit of lag, but hopefully you see me okay and hear me okay.
Hi, Jeremy. So my question to you would be as we have seen over the years, and you rightly pointed out that this social media platform is a platform which is throwing a lot of information at us, and one of the biggest challenges is to how make sense out of it. But I also believe that the biggest challenge is like how do we weigh credibility of this information which is being thrown at us. Also, we have seen at the hindsight of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, like where Facebook was used as a platform to drive the US polls. So how do you think we can overcome these kind of challenges in the future? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And we haven't talked about data specifically related to Cambridge Analytica and the other aspects of that. When we first began studying Facebook, there were people in the US military, for example, who were concerned because service people might want to use social media, because young people came into the military using social media. And one of the early things that we realized was there was a real danger on Facebook when people allowed access through third-party access. And early on, Facebook wasn't very careful about that. They let a lot of developers create third-party apps for them because they were popular. The problem was there wasn't much oversight, and those apps could collect a lot of data that people didn't realize were being collected. So, for example, some of the quiz apps that were on Facebook, you know, if I had a friend, and keep in mind, I have something like 1,300 Facebook friends. If any one of them on some of these apps did a quiz app, now the app was not only collecting their data, it was collecting my data as well. So Facebook didn't have things walled off very well, despite the fact that was their promise. And we even saw this with NodeXL, because before Cambridge Analytica, we could run a social network map on any public page, not just the ones that we owned, without anybody's consent. And that really wasn't a good model. It wasn't, if not a legal question, it was certainly an ethical question. And so I actually think what's happened since Cambridge Analytica is good. The Facebook folks have tightened up on that API. The problem still with social media data, particularly Facebook/Instagram, is that from the start, this company has been using data collected about its users. And the users really don't get a great idea of what the company is doing with that data. My colleague, Mark Smith, at the Social Media Research Foundation, who runs NodeXL out in Menlo Park, California, believes in the idea that our data have value, and therefore what we need is a data bank. We should be able to deposit our data in these data banks that are social media sites, but then we should be able to withdraw all of that data, take it with us, be portable, take it to another site, and not leave it in control through these terms of service agreements with the folks who run these sites, such as Facebook. It's a challenging idea because you have data, I have data, we have interactions that cut across our Facebook walls, for example. So I don't think there's any easy way to manage privacy. And I know, we're in this country starting to adopt European EU GDPR standards. The state of California has adopted a state law that pretty much complies with GDPR, and most of the sites that want to be global are complying with that standard. But I think there's still a great discussion in my country that needs to be had about the value of privacy as a human right. The international law component of this. And it's a challenge because in the United States, we have a very individualistic culture. And a lot of the EU and international standards are more community-based. So I think that's one of those areas that is still evolving. And I agree with you, there are many challenges. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, so we have to figure out better ways to handle data. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your insights. Any more questions? We'll be taking one more question.
Hello, sir. Areas, like my question is, there are areas where there are access to internet, still do not have access to internet. So, what kind of marketing strategy we have to follow there?
What kind of, I didn't get the end of that.
Yeah, so what kind of marketing strategy we have to follow to reach them when they are not able to access internet? the third world country?
Sure. Well, let me point you to an online resource. I have a friend named Keith Quisenberry, who's a marketing professor, and he's written a social media marketing book that I've used in my class. He has a website called postcontrolmarketing.com, postcontrolmarketing.com, and he has templates that allow you to develop strategies. Among the areas that you have to pay attention to in the early part of marketing strategy are, have you done a SWOT analysis? Do you know your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? And then based on that, can you use smart marketing strategies, basically strategies based on what you can measure? What we do in the social media lab is we benchmark data. So, if I look at my Twitter feed and I have 5 or 6 people who like posts or engage with me, or I have a certain reach over the course of a week or a month, that's a benchmark that I can start with. And then I'm going to develop strategies, perhaps do A/B testing and try different content and see if I can move the needle. There's a lot of trial and error in social media marketing. We have a lot of theory about electronic word of mouth, EWAM, and I would encourage you to look at some of that literature, some of that research, because there are some really sophisticated models in EWAM. But I think it brings us back to what resonates with your audience. There's a marketer in my country. His name is Gary Vaynerchuk. He's at Gary VEE on Twitter. He does a lot with Instagram and LinkedIn, and Gary puts out a lot of content. He puts out multiple posts a day, but he also personally reads comments from his audience, his fans. He pays a lot of attention to the feedback. And I think that's the best approach, is you have to learn to listen, do that real-time social media listening that public relations firms have developed over time. PR firms, large ones such as Edelman and Golan in Chicago, have developed some really nice methods for doing this. Use dashboards, Twitter analytics, Facebook insights, Union metrics for Instagram. Use all of these tools to spend a lot of time studying your audience, because the better you know your audience, the easier it's going to be to give them content that they want to see. But there's no perfection in this. Sometimes you sort of strike gold with a single post and then you can't replicate it. It just happens that at that moment in time, that was the content against all other content that was competing that worked. So I think that's why you have to develop long-term strategy, and you have to distinguish between getting 1,000 or 1,000,000 likes and that kind of shallow engagement with the deeper engagement that can drive behavior. The more you build true communication, which involves speaking and listening, the better the engagement is going to be. That's true face to face. You're talking to somebody, you got to listen, but it's also even more true in mediated communication, such as social media. So I think that's a great question if I understood it correctly. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for providing us with your valuable time and shedding some light on how social media is affecting our day-to-day life. I would now call on Deepti ma'am for a vote of thanks.
Thank you. I'll tweet on Twitter.
Yes, and thank you, Jeremy. This is a very formal vote of thanks. Thank you so much for waking up so early in the morning on a weekend and spending time with us. And I'm sure my students will take back a lot of that you've offered to us. And also, use social media to generate optimal content, like you said. And also, probably we look forward to having your book in our library soon, and going through it in much more detail. I think it's in 2020 it's releasing, right, the book?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you
And
so much.
and if you do have questions after this, feel free to tweet those out to me at Jeremy HL. I'm really happy to field questions and to get to know you better online as well.
All right. Thank you so much, and you have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.